Are you having trouble getting your players to actually fall for your traps or simply not notice that they're there? Today we're going to go over traps and some really cool ones that you can put in your campaign.
Welcome everyone, I'm Sean, this is Tony, and today we're going to be talking about traps and how you can use it in your own homebrew campaign.
Well, I'll tell you what, Sean, the one thing that drives me nuts, or did when I was an early DM, was how do I actually get my players to fall into those traps?
Yeah.
Because you're like, okay, I have this great dungeon set up, and we got monsters over here, and we got this over there, and all right, I want to put a pit right here that they're going to fall into. And you know that the moment you describe that hallway, they're like, oh, well, there's a trap here. I use detect traps. And they detect a trap. And now all your fun is gone.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in the DMSguild, they do talk about how your players can look for traps and how they have to make the check and all that. But, the real question is, how can we utilize traps in a more interesting way and how can they be more permanent in your campaign? And
the first thing that I'll say, and this is something you learn early on, is that the moment you describe something in your room that seems odd, like your players aren't normally going to be looking for traps.
Usually, yeah.
Yeah. I call this the mimic theory, okay? So when you have something that is detrimental, but they don't know it, they don't look for it. So if you start describing the hallway or you start describing the floor, whereas normally you don't describe the floor, they're going to go, oh, I'd like to investigate the floor. And you go, all right, fine. And then, of course, they make the check. And if they don't make the check, then someone else in the group goes, well, I'd like to investigate the floor, too.
Yeah, and before you know it, you have a line of 5 people
they're all
just
crawling on the ground. And
rolling for investigation. So,
So some of the things that happen like that is like these traps. So that's number one. That's the rule. You don't describe what's going on. You just know in your head and chuckle to yourself as they just kind of walk in, right? The second thing is that when you're designing your traps, you have to think about how your players are going to react to the first portion of the trap.
Okay.
So, give me an example. So, a spike pit. This is kind
of the traditional spike pit. Yes, good old classic.
Who doesn't love a spike pit?
Players.
So, yeah. Well, so one of those things where the floor drops out and there's spikes on the bottom and the players fall onto them and impale themselves.
Sure.
Sounds great. Except when they step on it and the floor drops out and somebody goes, "Oh, I fly over the gap."
Yeah, or what's interesting, so much of the time, you fall into a spike pit and then you spend some movement to climb out and boop, all done.
Yeah, it's done a few little points of damage to me and what have you. But you can actually homebrew these things and make them a little bit more scary. Mm-hmm. For example, every spike pit that I put in now, just players that are watching right now, don't take heed. Every spike pit that I have, and I know I have flyers in the party, I put arrow slots on the sides of the walls.
Yeah.
So even if they decide to fly over, it's either darts or arrows that come flying out of them.
And that's a great idea because you think of the spike pit and you think you have your bases covered. Your players are creative and they have all these spells and all these class and racial features to basically get around this kind of stuff. You got to get creative and you got to cover your bases.
I actually have one that was similar to that. I think you were actually in the campaign at the time. We have this big chasm in the bottom of this thing, and instead of putting spikes on the ground, I put them all on the ceiling, right?
Yeah.
So then what happened was, okay, we're going to fly over the chasm. Well, I had this gust of wind come up from the bottom of the chasm that blew them up towards the spikes, and they had to make their saves to try and be heavier than what was blowing up.
Someone almost died from that.
Yes, we actually had a dwarf on a leash. He was like a
balloon.
Weather balloon. Yeah, it was crazy. But that's some of the things you can do with it.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, the least you describe it, the better it is.
Right, and there's a difference between covering your bases with a trap and making a trap that's impossible. You don't want to make the trap so that, you'll always get damage. That's a good example of, the wind blowing with the spikes because it wasn't impossible to not get hurt. If you think and you strategize, you can get around it without a scratch.
And we had people that teleported from one side to the other. Yeah. That was fine. But then you had people that couldn't do that.
Exactly.
So you got to look at it. But, again, your character's reaction to what you're putting in front of them is what's important. That same dungeon, we had a big elevator that came down, and there was all these boxes and all this other stuff, right? And there was all this coin that was there, but they had an item that turned coin into fruit. which would essentially make it heavier, right?
Yeah.
So the thing is once they got down to the bottom, they put enough weight on this thing to bring that elevator down. Now, how do they get back up? That the trap was not in like something that hurt them, but it was something that stuck them in a position where they couldn't get out.
Yeah, and that's another example. Like not all traps necessarily have to take away hit points. Maybe it just gets them stuck. Maybe it takes stuff away. So that's another good example as well.
Now, the other things that you can do with that is, let's say we're talking about, okay, it doesn't always have to trap the person.
Yeah.
Trap the person. But at the same time, you can add things like madness, exhaustion, things like that are part of that detriment the person's progress through things.
Yeah, not all traps just have to be about, oh, you take 4d6 damage. Maybe they get hit with that arrow, but that arrow was laced with a poison that now gives them a level of poison, and now they have disadvantage on attacking and ability checks,
and you can actually flavor that to a way that certain parts of their bodies are getting hit, and now they're slower because of it. I've done traps where somebody gets hit with that dart, and now all of a sudden they start, they're limping, so their movement speed has gone down quite a bit.
Yeah.
Or the grung. When you have grung with their poisons and stuff.
Yeah.
Now you're looking at how is that grung poison in a dart or something. How would that do it? And there was one thing with that. That campaign was full of traps.
That definitely had a theme.
But we had, you have a grung one that makes you want to go into water. There's a grung poison that makes you want to go into water.
That's right.
And by lacing a trap with that poison, at the end I had this rushing stream of water that would have pushed them all the way back to the beginning of the dungeon. And now they're compelled, I must get in the water. So the players were spending their time trying not to have their friend dive into the water and then go all the way back to the beginning of the campaign.
And that's great because especially when you're designing like a dungeon or a cave or something, you can, if you have the time and the effort, you can kind of plan your traps to combo off on each other. Like maybe you have a trap that gives that person disadvantage on a certain saving throw. The next trap is something on that saving throw. Like things like that.
Yeah, you have that and you've got the piranhas that are actually in that water.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
Now he wants to go into the water and be pushed downstream. At the same time, he's making these checks to try to get back upstream. There's these little things that are biting at him.
Exactly.
But that brings into a good point, is that there is actually a lot of traps out there. And there's a lot of homebrew traps out there. Now, you're not going to find these on D&D Beyond. You will find them on the DMSguild, though.
Yeah, and today we're going to be looking at traps. And this one's from David Gibson. Then his whole theme is called 5 Minute Workday Presents. So this one is looking into traps. And this one's
that's the 5 MWD.
Yeah.
Okay, 5 MWD, 5 Minute Workday.
Yeah. Now this is really cool. This basically goes off of the mechanic of traps that you find in the Dungeons Master Guide in 5th edition. However, this adds a lot of different variety in the kinds of traps that you can toss at your players.
And some of them, it'll give you a base of what kind of trap it is. Like you got an arrow launcher or crushing walls and everything. And then it gives you several different ways that you can actually make that work.
Yeah, so for the crushing walls, maybe it's crushing walls within a chamber, or maybe it's within a small hallway. The nice thing is that this file actually kind of gives you different stipulations on what that kind of trap is. Now, we're just going to go through some of the more interesting ones. There's actually 7 pages worth of traps, but there are some that we would never have even thought of. So Dark Mist Cloud is kind of an interesting one. So basically, for example, spotting this pressure plate is a DC 14 check. Now, if you step on it, you end up taking 14 or 46 necrotic damage, and then you can get a blinded if you failed the con save and things like that. And the other one below it, which is a really good one.
This is the one I like. So you know how you're so used to rewarding your players? Well, this next one is a gift for the DM.
Oh yeah.
This is the exploding chest. And I don't know, most of the time when you go to a chest, if you do a mixture of exploding chests and mimics, you're going to create fear in your players for ever touching a chest ever again.
Yes, they will never want to open loot in their lives.
I'll tell you what, I would do this and then just out of the blue put a regular chest somewhere in the middle without anything around it, just to see the reaction of your players. But the exploding chest is pretty cool, so they'll get something out of it or try to get something out of it, and the thing just blows up and does this massive amount of damage in front.
Yeah, exactly. There's also one where it's a falling cage. So this one's kind of cool. You're already having your players inside of an enclosed space, but imagine that cage falling maybe even 30, 40, 50 feet. And this is kind of cool because, now they're like trapped inside of an enclosed space. They're falling down. They're taking the damage from taking the fall. And, you can kind of, use that to your advantage.
And putting these things together is the way to really make this kind of work. Now, I like the flooding chamber in this. And I know we're going into a lot of different things. We're not going to read you the whole PDF on there. You can pick it up for 50 cents if you like.
And it's a great deal.
Great deal. Sorry. For only 4 easy payments of $49.95. No, but for 50 cents, you can grab this full set of all these great traps. Hidden blades, gravity reversal, freezing jets. They're fantastic. My favorite, though, in this whole thing is the pool of false life.
Yeah.
This is wicked. This is absolutely wicked.
Right.
So, you make this nice, beautiful little lake, little pool inside the dungeon. You put it in so far in that your players are getting damaged and everything else as they're going. They're out of short rest.
And,
and there's this.
Describe it with a sauna.
Yeah, I would have little fairies floating around.
Oh yeah, like Legend of Zelda, like a fairy, like fairy healing pool. Oh yeah.
So you get there and you sip a little bit from the water. And you tell them it regains their hit points. You get the 1d4 hit points for the little sip that they take. What you don't tell them, or until after everyone has had a drink from it, is that it also reduces their maximum hit points by the same amount. So now they're drinking it and like, oh, okay, great. And it's now been something that's completely harmed them. It is so vicious and so underhanded. I love it. It is my personal favorite now. And I think this is something you can really use. It gives you a different thought.
Yeah, and going to how, sometimes traps not necessarily deal damage. This is kind of more strategic one. Like maybe your players know they're about to fight the big boss and they need the health. Do they risk drinking out of this pool, but also taking the sacrifice of lowering their maximum? Is it worth that kind of thing?
Yeah, and I've done similar things with that with health potions that like you go into an old alchemist laboratory or what have you, and there's old health potions on the desk, and like they're faded, they're not as bright red as they were, and then you drink them with it. And maybe it's, maybe it doesn't give you as much health back, or maybe it harms you in a certain way. Traps don't always have to be something people walk into. They can be items. They can be things that you pick up and you use. And I love that idea of just messing with their heads as far as the traps are concerned. I think the best dungeon that I ever created myself, which I loved, was the last battle with the Borgin and the dragon and all that stuff.
Okay, yeah.
I had a party of maybe about I won't make this long, but I had a party where I had like 7 or 8 people that were in the party, so I split them up. One was a lower level party, and the other was a high level party, and the two of them kind of went. The high level party went down in the tower, the other one went up in the tower, and everything that one party member did affected the other people. And it's just a neat way of looking at it and how to change it up.
Yeah.
It was kind of cool.
I think traps are a pretty underutilized thing in D&D 5e. However, they're a nice thing to toss into your campaign, whether your party is adventuring or traveling or in combat. It makes your party think, and it gives your players something else to do. Now, there's a lot that we can talk more about traps, and there's all these different kinds of things that you can do with it. If you have things that you want to hear about traps, or if you have your own traps that you want to submit.
I was going to say that. I think you guys should submit some traps to us, because we're going to start throwing things into new campaigns and stuff soon, and we would love to hear your thoughts on them. What's the craziest trap that you guys have come up with?
Yeah.
Just go ahead and send it to us, or put it down in the comments below. We always look at those, right?
So if there's more that you want to hear about traps, or if you want to send in your own traps, you can actually go ahead and leave a comment, or you can even send them over to us at our email at dmbrewcrew@gmail.com. We are going to be starting a new campaign where you might see your trap featured in our next session.
Absolutely. We would love to try it out and trick our players with it at the same time. So remember, the best campaigns are always the ones that are homebrewed. So until next time,
keep brewing.